On behalf of our Board of Trustees, it's my great pleasure to welcome you this evening. Our topic is a wonderful one, as you know. The future of American policy in a disordered world. And if you're not weary of our disordered world and our discussion of it, I should say if you are, this is going to elevate you this evening. And you'll enjoy it. Our guest has, as you know, had his book on the subject just published. His master's and bachelor's degree are from University College in Dublin. He holds a master's of philosophy degree from Cambridge University and a Ph.D. from Georgetown. He did postgraduate work at Harvard. He's been in Chicago. He was there as in two capacities, really. He was a lecturer at the Harris Public Affairs organization associated with the University of Chicago. And then he also was the executive director of studies for the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, whose head, Mr. Dalder, has been widely quoted and viewed over the last few days about Mr. Trump's interactions with NATO leaderships. In any case, our guest has been schooled in these matters. He's a longtime study of it. He's been published in major academic journals, of course, in the major news media as well. It's an enormous pleasure to present to you Dr. Thomas Wright.
Frank, thank you for that very generous introduction, and thank you for all of you for coming out this evening. It's a really terrific crowd. I guess must be something going on in the world. My job is to, I guess, talk about sort of the future of the international order. The international order is one of those really sort of abstract, unusual things that usually it's hard to get people interested in. I direct a center at Brookings called the Project on International Order and Strategy. And every few months I get a phone call from my mother saying, "Can you remind me what it is you do again? Because Aunt so-and-so is asking." And I know you've told me before, but I don't really know. It used to be called Managing Global Order, but we had to change the name when the world began to fall apart because people thought we were doing a very bad job. So that's sort of the task. You know, this international order, of course, has existed for about 70 years, back to after World War II. And I think over the years, many people predicted that it would come to an end at some point. Some said with a bang, some said with a whimper. No one really said with a tweet, but that's sort of where we are. But I would like to take a step back a bit because I think as we look at all of the things happening in the world, really, it's easy to fixate on the immediate, and I'm sure we'll have lots of time in the Q&A to talk about that and talk about all the controversies of the day. And I would just say on that now that I started about a year and a half ago. I saw a few news stories and I thought it would be interesting to look at Donald Trump's foreign policy track record, and I wrote a little piece on it looking back over 30 years. It's quite interesting, actually, because he talked about it from sort of the mid-'80s on in a way that's quite consistent. And I never thought that he would either stay in the race or win or run. And I think there is something, you know, there in terms of looking at a pattern about how he's changing the world and the particular ideas that he has. It's often very chaotic. I think it is quite radical, but I think we can sort of see a pattern to what he's doing. So I'm happy to talk about that at the end. But what I'd like to do is really begin, sort of take a step further back and look at some of the big changes going on in the world, because I think the international order wasn't in terrific shape, to be honest, on November 8, 2016, the day of the election. So to me, this predates President Trump, it predates the Trump administration, and it really is to do with fundamental changes, I think, in the world over the last 5 years or so, not really connected to President Obama as such, but rather to do with more tectonic shifts in the international system. when I look at the world after the Cold War, for those sort of 20 years, from 1991 to about 2011, 2012, I think the dominant sort of feature of world politics during that period was what I call sort of the notion of convergence. We lived in an age of convergence. Everyone believed that the major powers in the world, Russia, China, the United States, the Europeans, they would all have differences. Some would be democratic, some would not be, but they were all converging on the same sort of model of international order. They all believed that what we had in common was much more important than that which divided us. So the common threats of terrorism or climate change or pandemic disease or economic volatility, that superseded disputes about territory in a Rust Belt in Eastern Europe or islands in the South China Sea, and that really countries would disagree from time to time, and they may even end up in a crisis from time to time, but basically they would work together to try to sort out these common challenges. And so that went well beyond what sort of Francis Fukuyama talked about at the end of history, because he was really talking about domestic politics. But this sort of notion was that, you know, the world would be run by the G7 or the G8 or the G20, and that we will be into a very different future than the past. And I think there were several reasons about why that notion of convergence sort of took hold. One was unipolarity. You know, the United States was incredibly powerful after the Cold War, and it didn't really make sense for other countries to push back against it. Another was that the world, you know, was sort of working for everyone, that everyone, you know, they may have problems with it, people will complain, but basically the model of international order was delivering peace and prosperity, and so other countries didn't really have the incentive to push back. And then finally, as I mentioned, you had these big sort of threats out there, like Al-Qaeda, like some of the environmental challenges, like managing the global economy. And all of those came together, and what we saw really was the absence of something that political scientists call balancing. Political scientists talk about the way one country will balance against another's power to try to protect their own interests. And we sort of didn't see very much of that at all. We really saw the absence of geopolitical competition in the 1990s and the 2000s. So if you think back to the invasion of Iraq, you know, a very controversial decision by President Bush, Russia opposed that, but they only opposed it at the UN Security Council. They didn't send troops into Iraq. They didn't fight alongside Saddam Hussein. They didn't shoot down American planes or arm the Iraqis. Quite different, of course, to what they are doing today in Syria, where they did intervene in Syria. They are arming Assad. They would fight the United States if the United States was on the ground there. So I think we're seeing sort of the return of geopolitical competition between the major powers. And I think there's lots and lots of things happening in the world. I totally agree that ISIS is a major threat, and climate change and other problems are big challenges. But to me, the really new development is sort of the deterioration in relations between the big countries, particularly between the United States, China, and Russia. And that competition is playing out in all sorts of different ways around the world. I think it played out last year here in the election when Russia, you know, interfered using cyber warfare and other techniques. I think we see it in the economic war between the US and Russia over Ukraine. We see it in the South China Sea with China. And the thing about geopolitical competition is it makes everything else much more difficult, right? So it's much harder to cooperate even on matters of mutual interest when the world is much more geopolitically competitive and nationalistic. If you think back a few years ago, do you remember that Malaysian airliner, the first one that went missing? I think it was MH370, the first one before the one that Russia shot down. After that went missing, the Asian nations tried to come together to find it, and they actually couldn't agree on sharing the data from their satellites and from their search equipment, because they were worried that other countries may use that to find out their capabilities, and it would hurt them in a geopolitical conflict. So even something as simple as finding an airplane on which there were people from all nations on it, became much harder because of the geopolitical climate. So that's what I want to sort of talk to you this evening about, is how we ended up from that age of convergence to an age of divergence, where somehow the major powers diverged from each other, had very different notions of what the world order would look like. And I want to talk about what that will look like today. I think that what happened was essentially that convergence was a good idea. I think it would work for the peoples of the world, but it was basically unsustainable for several reasons. And this began to happen around 2008 to about 2012, 2013. The first reason, of course, was the financial crisis. That the financial crisis that occurred in 2008-09 really showed to many people around the world that the US-led international order that was created after World War II and consisted of an open global economy or Western economy early on and sort of alliances and institutions, that wasn't delivering what it promised. And that sort of set everything into reverse. And it raised doubt, particularly in China, about the sustainability of American power. It raised doubt in the United States and in Europe about the desirability of continuing global leadership. The second reason, I think, was that Russia and China in particular feared the United States, that the US was going to change its system of government. Russia, I think, wasn't particularly concerned about NATO troops. You hear that a lot, NATO expansion damaged Russia. I don't really buy that, because the US military presence in Europe has actually decreased substantially since the Cold War. You know, there's much less of a threat to Russia from that sphere. But I think Putin did worry about the spread of democracy. He did worry about color revolutions in Moscow. He worried about the expansion of the EU. And so he saw this as an existential threat. And China also sort of saw it as an existential threat. China's often forgotten in this, but they see sort of the US for push for human rights in places like Hong Kong and Tibet and elsewhere, and even within China as sort of a threat to their regime. So I think over time they began to lose confidence in convergence in that order. And then the third reason is that both China and Russia wanted a sphere of influence. As they became more powerful, they said, well, why can't we have more influence in Eastern Europe or East Asia? Why is it that the United States is asking us for help in Afghanistan or Iraq, but they're not actually giving us more of a say in our near abroad? And the final reason was what happened in the Middle East, of course, after the Arab awakening, when the notion of progress in the Middle East really came to an end. Both President Obama and President Bush, I think, believed both in very different ways that the Middle East could be transformed. President Bush by sort of the use of force, President Obama through indigenous sort of change in Middle Eastern countries, but both of those hopes were dashed really after the Arab awakening and the failure of the Arab awakening. So I think when you take all of those reasons together, what we sort of saw in that sort of extraordinary sort of 5-year period was, you know, the financial crisis, greater Chinese assertiveness, the return of Vladimir Putin and a much more aggressive foreign policy after 2012 in Russia, the rise to power of Xi Jinping in 2012 as well, and a much more aggressive and assertive Chinese approach, and then these doubts sort of about American leadership and America's sort of role in the world. And so as I look at it, what sort of began to happen around that time was sort of the dawn of a new era, and we're still really trying to figure out what that is. I think that's really the million-dollar question here, is not really whether the old order is in trouble or not. I think everyone knows that it sort of is, but it's how do we think about the future? What's sort of coming next? Is it going to be a different type of global order, no order at all, or something sort of in between? And my best guess, and sort of what I wrote the book about, was that I think we're entering into a period of a renewed geopolitical competition between the major powers, but with a big twist from the past. It's not like the 19th century, because this geopolitical competition is taking place against the backdrop of globalization and sort of unprecedented interdependence. So we've been integrating like crazy for 20 years. And if you just think about economically, all of the financial systems of all the major countries are interlinked now. Communications are all interlinked now. And now we're sort of waking up and everyone's becoming more nationalistic, and everyone's becoming more have a greater rivalry with each other, but we're all integrated with each other, so we're all vulnerable to each other. And nobody wants a big war. China doesn't want to fight the United States doesn't want to fight Russia, and Russia doesn't want to fight the US. But everyone will use, and that's the title of the book, sort of all measures short of war, all these types of leverage, whether it's cyber or sanctions or coercive diplomacy to try to get their way, even proxy wars in the Middle East and other types of limited conflicts. So I think we're actually entering into a period in which there is going to be much more tension and much more difficulty in cooperation, and some of these institutions and economic cooperation will come under real strain. But I don't think, contrary to, if you look at Graham Allison's new book that he has out on US-China relations, I don't think we're on the cusp of conflict or major war, but I think we're looking at a prolonged period of peacetime competition. So I think that this competition, I think, will be very unlike what we've sort of seen before. So I'd like to go into a little bit on that. I'd like to look at Europe and East Asia, because to me, this is sort of where the center of this competition is. When I think about the global order, a lot of people say it's the UN, or it's the IMF, or the World Bank, or, FIFA even on soccer or something else, all these global institutions. But to me, it's actually regional orders. The reason there's this international order is because the US helped build a healthy regional order in Europe and East Asia after World War II. And that's sort of the foundation of everything else. If those regional orders fall apart, then everything falls apart. And Russian or Chinese behavior in their region is actually much more indicative of their approach to global order than their approach to the IMF or to the World Bank or even to the UN. So I think those things are very important. But to me, it's really these regions that are absolutely the key. And that's why I'm very worried, actually, by the return of Russian aggression in Europe or by China's sort of assertiveness in East Asia, because that is sort of destabilizing those key regions. So I'd like to talk about each of those briefly, because I think it's sort of really important to understanding what's at stake and why I think it's important that the US continues to be involved. When we look at Europe, what we really see is a sort of 5 major crises that are all happening simultaneously. It's really interesting. 5 years ago, people were writing articles in major newspapers saying that Europe was irrelevant because everything was fine and they had nothing to contribute to US policy elsewhere. There was a famous article by someone saying basically, the US should ignore Europe because there's nothing to worry about anymore there. And that was only 5 years ago. And now we look at the 5 crises that have happened. The first one, of course, is the Eurozone crisis, which was already underway by that stage, but some people thought it was over. But that really was a huge thing, because what that did was it divided Europe down the middle between sort of the north and the south, roughly speaking, in terms of creditor nations and debtor nations. And it was a tragedy because, as a German commentator put it, the definition of a tragedy is when both sides are right. And both sides in this case were right? Germany had a point. Greece and others were sort of irresponsible. But the southern countries had a point too, because Germany had loaned all of the money through their banks and they were irresponsible. And they decided the music stopped, and then each country had to deal with their own mess. And Germany said it had nothing to do with it. And so there were 2 sides to this story. But this was a particularly damaging political problem that really sapped the energy of the centrist parties. And so what we've seen every year since 2009 is the reduction in influence of the center-right and center-left and the rise of sort of the extremes. And that has put Europe in a very vulnerable position. The second crisis was the Russia crisis. When Putin came back, he really chucked out everything that Medvedev was looking at in terms of structural reform. Putin can't reform Russia in a really fundamental way, because it would mean getting rid of the corruption and actually introducing a rule of law and doing all the things that would actually result in him losing power. So he wasn't going to do that, so he took another path, a much more nationalistic path. confrontation with the US, and that led directly to the first ever annexation in Europe since World War II of Crimea, and the invasion of another part of Ukraine, and a war that continues to today, and a much more aggressive Russian policy that really sees the EU and NATO as an enemy. Putin, I think, wants the weakening or even the destruction of NATO and the European Union. This is a fundamental change for Europeans, because they always believed they lived in sort of a benign environment where everyone wanted them to succeed, and now they have an active opponent. So that's the second big crisis. The third, of course, is Syria and North Africa, and the refugee problem that's flowed from there, and the immense instability in the Middle East, and the way in which that has directly impacted Europe and really undermined the EU, because it's undermined confidence in the openness of borders, and exposed the inability of Europe to actually manage its migration problems collectively. The fourth crisis is Brexit, which is continuing at the moment, and we have a very interesting election coming up in about a week, I guess. I think it's a week from tomorrow, where, I don't know if you've been following this, but Theresa May called a snap election in the expectation she would win a historic majority of over 150 seats. And according to an opinion poll yesterday, she's likely to fall short of a majority by about 16 seats. So that may not hold, but it will be an extraordinary turnaround. But it just goes to show this political instability. But Brexit is really a major issue that is going to dominate European politics for the next couple of years at least. And the final crisis is Trump. And I mean this in all. I don't mean to sort of score a political point, but it's Trump, because he is questioning the fundamentals of the transatlantic alliance, and European countries are worried about what that means in terms of if they have to go it alone. Maybe they should go it alone. That's something we could debate, but it is a fundamental change. And what's interesting to me about all of these changes is that, we used to talk about the positive synergies between different, if you had economic growth, it would lead to more mobility, and it would result in democracy and interdependence and promote peace. All of these actually have negative synergies. So they all negatively reinforce each other. Russia helps to stoke the refugee crisis in Syria because it wants to undermine the EU, and it takes advantage of the political recession caused by the Eurozone crisis. And you see all of these things reinforcing each other. And so to me, Europe is sort of very exposed at the moment to Russian power, because Putin is in a relatively weak position. Russia's not a rising power, it's a declining power. But as Henry Kissinger once said, Russia's been a declining power for 400 years. So it hasn't mattered too much so far. They make up for it in other ways. And they have made up for it because they've really expanded their deployable power. They've expanded their military power. And they have a greater will maybe than Western countries do in terms of how to use that power. So I think what we see with Putin is he's really probing this very vulnerable situation in Europe with limited uses of power, but very effectively. And he's very effectively putting everyone off balance. So I think that's what's happening in Europe. And I think the stakes for the United States are very, very high. In East Asia, it's very, very different. China's not a declining power, it's a rising power. It's not a land power, it's a maritime power. It has a land border, obviously, to the west, but all of its problems really are at sea. With East Asian countries in South China Sea and the East China Sea, and with the US Navy then more broadly. And it has lots of options. It doesn't need to rely on invasions because it has many economic tools and other things it can do. So it's very, very different. And China, of course, also has a much bigger stake in the global economy. Russia, I think, wants to see the global economy weakened because it believes that it's vulnerable to the global economy, and any time the global economy is strong, it just means that the West is stronger than it is. So Putin, I think, is happy to see that weakened. There was a very famous story that Hank Paulson tells in the 2008-9 financial crisis. This is in the fall of 2008 when he went to Beijing, and the Chinese said to him that Russia had proposed that they collaborate with China to dump Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac bonds to try to collapse the U.S. economy, to take advantage of the financial crisis. Paulson tells this story in his memoir. And the Chinese said no, that they wanted to see a strong global economy and a recovery, because that was in China's interest, and they immediately told the United States about it. But that just gives you an indication of these differences between the two. But China is very different. I think it has an interest in a global order that works, but it also is a revisionist power in its region. So it wants to see the US sort of push back. It wants to share power, I think, with the United States and East Asia, which means having a much bigger sphere of influence in the South China Sea and East China Sea. And so it's doing lots of things like island building and coercive diplomacy and using its civilian vessels to try to establish its influence, because it would like to create a more China-centric order in which other countries checked with China about their major economic and domestic and foreign policy decisions. And that is really sort of the nature of the struggle there. It is one that's really preoccupying US naval forces, and we see it sort of playing out with Japan in the East China Sea, with the Philippines and Vietnam and Singapore and others in the South China Sea, and then sort of in different and odd ways in North Korea and elsewhere. But that's sort of the broader drama, I think, is that Xi Jinping sees this opportunity to sort of recreate this sort of Chinese-led regional order, and the US is pushing back with its allies. And so I think that that's sort of the regional picture as I see it. Before I move on to because I want to leave lots of time for questions, but before I move on to what the US can do about it, I would like to just say a word about the Middle East, because I haven't mentioned that yet. And I think that is a major, that's something that sort of dominates a lot of our thinking. And so it's sort of strange to have a talk on order and not really mention the Middle East. And I think it is important, but in sort of in a relatively unusual way, because the Middle East doesn't have a major power like Russia or China. It has Iran, and Iran is a very troublesome power, but it's not on a level, I think, with Putin or with Xi Jinping. But really the distinctive feature of the Middle East is that it's unraveling. It's in a state of complete collapse after the Arab awakening, that status quo that really existed has been completely eroded. And what we've seen is the emergence of a regional Cold War between the Sunni Arab states on the one hand, and then the Shia states led by, of course, by Iran on the other hand. And that competition is very different in the actual Cold War, because it's fought within borders. It's about who controls Iraq, or who controls Bahrain, or who controls Syria. And it's about Shia minority or majority populations in some cases pushing up against these regimes that were traditionally led by Sunni leaders. And we see this very sort of intensive regional competition, particularly between the Saudis and Tehran. And we saw a lot of that play out last week with the sword waving and the orb touching with Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia, when he had this big sort of love fest with King Salman, which was sort of understandable because the region really wanted the United States back, right? But what's going on in the Middle East, I think, is this sort of regional Cold War between these different groups. And during the Obama administration, the United States pulled back because President Obama was worried that the US would get dragged into this. So he wanted to narrowly define U.S. interests as no nuclear proliferation, no terrorism, relationship with Israel, alliance with Israel, and a couple of other things, free flow of oil. But he didn't want to care about the broader stability of the region. And this question, sort of came up when he described it once as a 30 years war. He said, why would you get involved in this if it's a 30 years war? But actually, that was a very interesting analogy, because the 30 years war killed a third of the population of Central Europe when it happened before the Peace of Westphalia. And what really illustrated to me is that the question in the Middle East is this. It's whether or not for the major powers, the cost of being involved is greater than the cost of contagion to the rest of the world if you don't get involved, right? So the United States pulled back from the Middle East, but I can assure you that when Obama pulled back, he didn't think it may result in the collapse of the EU, right? He thought it might result in the collapse of parts of the Middle East, but he didn't think the refugee flows could actually topple Angela Merkel and destroy the European Union. And so all of these regions are interlinked. Like, we think about Europe, we think about East Asia, we think about the Middle East as separate, and we talk about pivoting from one to the other. But one of the main messages I'm trying to convey this evening is that it is still sort of global because these regions are integrated. And what happens in the Middle East affects Europe and it affects East Asia and vice versa. And so we need to think about these things holistically, even though we're looking at these regional competitions. And so I think when we look at the Middle East and we look at the threat that ISIS poses, and it's a very real threat, we need to think about the broader geopolitical impact of instability. You know, is it really viable to have a raging civil war in Syria that has killed already about 500,000 people, probably more, continuing indefinitely, with lots of powers getting dragged in? And so I think even if this president or a future president decided to sort of leave the Middle East, the US would still get dragged back in later under someone else because the problems are so big. And so that, I think, is sort of how I see the Middle East fitting into this. So I'll just conclude with 10 minutes or so just on what the US can do, because I don't want to sort of outline this terrible situation and then say there's absolutely nothing we can do about it. You know, and I immigrated here from Ireland actually about 17 years ago, and it was sort of pointed out to me shortly after I moved that you can never finish a talk in the US on a pessimistic note. That's sort of a Celtic or Scottish thing to do. It's sort of the world is doomed, there's nothing we can do, you know, because in the US it's like the world is doomed unless you follow my 3-point plan, in which case it will completely be fine. Unless you buy the book, the world is doomed. That's the. But no, I think that when we look at this broader picture, to me, it's a very different world than the one that we've just come out of, right? It's one where we need to think more seriously about major power competition. If I had one big fault with Obama, it was that he underestimated the risks from major powers like Russia and China, because he thought that the problems that would emerge would be rather limited with them, and they could be sort of pigeonholed into a particular area. I think we saw last year that certainly was not the case with Russia. And I think when I think about strategy, I try to think about what are the problems we're trying to solve. So if I could summarize it, I think there are two problems that arise out of what I just said. One is the United States needs a way of dealing with revisionist major powers like Russia and China. What revisionist powers do is that they go after things that seem unimportant initially. And then they say, you don't want to jeopardize your whole relationship with us over something that's unimportant. So they say, you know, Putin says, you don't really care about Crimea or Ukraine. Why would you actually fight me over that? And he's sort of half right, you know, and the Chinese are sort of half right that the US shouldn't care, you know, about the islands in the South China Sea so much that it would jeopardize the relationship with China overall. But the problem is that one little island might not matter, but 20 islands might matter. You know, one little piece of Ukraine might not matter, but Ukraine plus the Baltics plus other parts of Eastern Europe matter a lot. And it's the old salami slicing problem, right, that someone can start out that way, and it may look, each instance may look small, but in the aggregate it's actually a lot. And the problem is, how do you deter each little bit? So I think that's the first major problem, and it's one that strategists back at the early Cold War period really recognized as a huge difficulty that the US needed to overcome, that the US needed a way, and their solution was almost to be irrational, was to threaten, you know, Armageddon over Berlin, which was actually relatively small in strategic terms, but was seen as very important in terms of the precedent for the overall Cold War. So I think that's one big issue. And the second is the obvious one in the age we live in, that how do you build a liberal international order in a populist and nationalist age? You know, when you have countries that are much less cooperative, when you have people within countries that don't really believe in the mission anymore, when you have a global economy that's in recession or with very slow growth. And so I think those are the two big problems. And the good news is I think the US has a choice. I'm actually maybe this is because I'm an immigrant, but I'm very optimistic about the United States. I don't think the US is in decline at all. I think a lot of that has been way overblown. The US, I think, has many advantages. There's parts of the US that are rising, even relative to other countries, relative to China. There are parts that are maybe more problematic. But I think that and I can talk about that more in Q&A, but I think the US is very much competitive in this situation. So I think it's up to the US to decide what strategy it wants to take. And as I see it, there's sort of two broad options. The political scientists Steven Savanovich describes it as a minimalist and maximalist. In American history, some presidents have wanted to minimize sort of U.S. actions and influence overseas to the bare necessities, and others have tried to maximize it. And as I look at the first option, it's sort of a minimalist option. It's one of restraint. It's trying to do less, maybe cede a sphere of influence to Russia or China, saying that we can live and sort of cooperate in a world that is more nationalistic, is more mercantilist, pull back, be a little bit more focused in their own ways. You know, even though they're very, very different, I think President Obama and President Trump were sort of similar in that broad philosophical direction. I mean, I know I probably alienate everyone here by saying that, but I think there is a little bit of similarity in terms of both of them wanting to do less, pass the burden to others, you know, defining U.S. interests quite narrowly, and that world, I think, would lead to a world which is very different than today. Ultimately, it would be a world in which it was more, the regions were more divided, and there probably would be a little bit less cooperation, but the U.S. would be a little bit less involved. The second option, which is the one I make the case for in the book, is an option I call responsible competition. And it's how do you compete to preserve the liberal international order that we've had in the past, but in a responsible way. And that begins, I think, with recognizing that the defining feature of our world today is that it's more geopolitically competitive. And we need to sort of embrace that and recognize that it is challenged and to push back against revisionist powers, but to do so recognizing that there are areas where we have common interests. With China, for instance, there's a common interest in the global economy. I think Chinese actions to its west and Central Asia with the One Belt, One Road that you may have heard about and other things are much less damaging than its actions in the South China Sea, and we should be positive about some of those things and actually encourage them in that. So I think responsible competition is about recognizing sort of the two aspects to it. But on the competitive side, I think we do need to be more focused on trying to deter Russian aggression in Eastern Europe or some of China's actions in the South China Sea. And I would say it's not really about stopping every little island or stopping every little Russian provocation. And we need to be thinking more about how do you build a situation of strength overall to deny maybe Putin his objective in Eastern Europe, to ensure that even if he has a little gain on Crimea, that he's in an overall weaker position because Europe is sort of prosperous and strong and the countries that want to be democratic can be democratic. And so I think there's a way of sort of responding to the sphere of influence problem. I think we need to look at it. I know there's been a lot of discussion on allies recently and NATO and whether there's enough burden sharing. And I think it is important that allies do more. And it is important that they spend 2% of GDP. But I would caution against being overly simplistic about how we interpret that. You know, if you look back, people I'm sure here supported the Iraq War and opposed the Iraq War. But if you look back to the Iraq War, 7 or 8 European countries fought with the United States in Iraq for one reason, which was the President of the United States asked them to. That was a burden-sharing thing. They didn't really want to do it. They did it because it was an alliance issue. There were Estonian troops in Afghanistan. Why on earth would Estonia, a country of a couple of million people, send troops to Afghanistan? The answer is the alliance with the United States, right? The President of the United States asked Estonia to do that. Hundreds of Poles died in Afghanistan as well. Same logic, right? So I think when we look at this sort of burden-sharing argument, we need to recognize that, you know, there are definitely shortcomings on the European side, but it's also a more nuanced picture. And Europe also does quite a lot on the development and the foreign assistance side that may compensate a little bit. So I think there's lots that can be done there. I will just finish with a word about the current situation and about President Trump, because I think when we look at all of this, what sort of strikes me in a way is that the U.S. is engaged in a competition, that President Trump sees it sort of in a competitive terms, but I worry that he's sort of pushing in the wrong direction, because if you think of the world as a choice between two different types of world, one is recognizable to what we had in the past of sort of a liberal order that's open, that there's a global economy where everyone's integrated, trade that sort of, that results in growth everywhere and positive sum games, and that we see security alliances and peace and stability, that's one world. And the other is the one I described as sphere of influence world, where the borders and the lines are blurred and the risk of miscalculation is very high, and Russia has a much more dominant role in Europe and China in East Asia. Trump is actually pushing for the second option, because the America First policy is really about pulling back and focusing on narrow interests. And the extraordinary thing about American foreign policy for 70 years is that the American strategists defined U.S. interests very broadly as a healthy international system where the U.S. could prosper and be secure. And I think that still, to me, is still very much a goal that's achievable. And so I don't necessarily think that the president's going to read my book and say that's the strategy. I really doubt it. But I do think that some version of trying to preserve and protect this 70-year legacy of international order is worth trying for. And I think that future presidents will come back to it. So thank you very much, and I really look forward to your questions. Should I feel my own, or? If you would. Yeah, great. Yes, just here. The question is, how do if presidents change, are we looking at a different foreign policy in a few years' time, a sort of reversal from what Trump is doing at the moment? And then in Europe, that the problems are actually quite a lot deeper because of the structural sort of unemployment and some of the economic problems, that if their political prognosis may be worse. I hope I'm paraphrasing that correctly. I hope so on the first. I mean, I do think that it does change, but I would say that I think there is a risk that there's a dynamic that happened in the 30s, that the U.S. stayed out of problems and they got worse. And then the people who wanted to stay out, see, it's really terrible, you can't do anything. And every time it got worse, it just reinforced not getting involved until it got so bad that it dragged everyone in. Right, and there's a risk what we're seeing in the Middle East today, that if the situation just continues to get bad, then everyone just throws their hat at it and says, there's no point in even trying, which may be understandable, but then at some point it may blow up completely in a way that it drags everyone in. So I think that's one risk, and I think there is also a problem that we might be seeing the emergence of a much more nationalistic foreign policy in both parties, and that if that were to happen, I think. Maybe it would be two different versions of America Firstism in 2020. So I think we need to wait and see on that. I think we just don't know how it will turn out. On Europe, I sort of agreed with what you're saying about a year ago, but I have a little bit of hope now with Macron in France. A young guy, but very serious, very focused, very smart on structural reform and trying to get the French economy moving again. Maybe he'll fail, maybe it won't work. But what he's accomplished politically has been extraordinary. He's 39 years old. He had no party. He really was given no chance. And so I think there are little flickers of hope in Europe that we'll see where they go. And to me, the big question in Europe is there's been a lost decade in Europe after the financial crisis. Is that a short lost decade that ends around now, or is it a long, never-ending lost decade like in Japan that basically lasted for 20 years? And I hope that actually they'll come out soon. But we'll know in a couple of years, I think, when we see whether Macron has any traction or not. No, great question. So there are three questions there. The first is, can the dollar be replaced as the key currency in the world? The second is, how do you address this domestic discontent, sort of a lack of economic confidence in the international order, and whether infrastructure and economic rebuilding at home is part of an answer to it? And the third was on Korea, and particularly the role of the US and China on Korea policy. So let me sort of just address those in turn, if I may. I don't think the dollar is actually endangered. I mean, I think the thing about a key currency, a reserve currency, is its competitors, right? And so there can be a problem with the dollar, but the dollar is as strong, is as weak as other currencies are strong. And there is no currency that could possibly displace the dollar, I think. The Chinese currency is way, way, way behind. It's still not really convertible to the extent that it needs to be, and I think they have a long way to go on that. The only currency that's conceivable as an alternative is the euro, and there I think there's really very little chance because for structural reasons. There's no financial union in Europe, no real banking union, and there's no real fiscal union. And that, I think, leaves the euro at a massive disadvantage. Now, sometimes what people will say is, well, okay, so they're all weak, but if you put them in a basket of currencies called sort of SVRs, is a technical term, that basket will be an alternative. And it's true that there is a basket of alternatives, and some countries are diversifying, but that's not a replacement, I think. So I'm still pretty confident in the dollar, but I do think that the skeptics are right in one thing, which is just because the dollar is sort of irreplaceable doesn't mean that we can be sort of incredibly foolish and have a very foolish economic policy, that it's important to make sure that that's still pretty sound. I think it is, but I think it's important to maintain that over time. The second question on Tip O'Neill, it's a great point, and it's one I really have a hard time with because, I could give you a lot of different answers, but ultimately this is really a domestic politics question, right? And it gets to distribution of growth domestically and all of these communities that we saw, and people are sort of very dissatisfied with globalization. And I think that is a real challenge. I do agree, I think, that infrastructure, I think, would help. But I would just make one sort of additional point, which is the reason I think ultimately we need to maintain confidence in the international economic order and that model is that when you look at populists all over the world, they all sort of have one thing in common, which is they all blame somebody else. Right, and they all basically say that our economic problems are because some other country is taking advantage of us. Now, that may on certain occasions be true, right? That's not always untrue. But it does leave one problem, which is none of them have an agenda for global growth. So they have an agenda for domestic growth that usually involves taking advantage of some other country. But I believe that in the 21st century, we can't have a strong national economy in any country without a strong global economy. There has to be an agenda for global growth, and our problem is actually the lack of global growth. It's these structural imbalances. It's the fact, I think, that Germany is not spending enough in investment. China hasn't been spending enough in investment. That's beginning to change with One Belt, One Road. That's why I think that's a good thing. So I think we need to sort of address that piece of it as well. And then finally on Korea, I just got back from China last week. And I spent 4 days with some pretty senior Chinese foreign policy people. And I came back a little depressed. They're not going to do that much in North Korea. I'm pretty sure about that. They probably can't do a huge amount, but they are going to do just enough. President Trump has told them that they are absolutely vital to solving North Korea, and they will make sure that that is true for the remainder of Trump's term in office. So they will give certain cooperation, but they won't really solve the problem. It's probably not really solvable because ultimately it comes down to this, which is there is virtually no level of economic pain that you could imagine could be inflicted in North Korea that will cause Kim Jong-un to abandon his nuclear weapons program. Right? Any level of economic pain will probably cause him to double down on it. It is theoretically possible that a massive amount of pain may cause him to negotiate a freeze, but it's pretty unlikely because one of the little secrets about North Korea is that its economy is actually doing pretty well. Its economy's been growing. It's a low bar, that's true, but it's been growing a little bit, and they've actually diversified a little bit, and they're more resilient than they used to be. They went through a famine, and they didn't give up their nuclear weapons program. They're vastly ahead of that now. And so China can put pressure on, but it may not be effective. And if they put huge pressure on and North Korea collapsed, that would be a catastrophe from China's point of view. And they don't want to do that. And so I think what we're looking at is really muddling through, but to an unhappy outcome where ultimately North Korea will get an ICBM capability. The US will be faced with a choice about whether or not it acts or not or tries to contain it. But I don't really see any sort of real solution to that problem, unfortunately. two great questions. One on Afghanistan, why are we still in Afghanistan? And then South China Sea, about Southeast Asian nations, I presume you mean Vietnam, Philippines, and others, in terms of whether they can push back on their own. So, you may have said it's a simplistic question, but it's very important. I think, Afghanistan wasn't discussed in the campaign. It's not really been discussed now. As I understand it, there's a massive argument within the Trump administration on whether to send more troops to Afghanistan. Those who are in favor say that without it, you'll have the return of a failed state and increased terrorism threat. Those who are opposed say that there are plenty of failed states already where ISIS is operating out of, and that U.S. interests in Afghanistan are very limited, and that it's one thing to keep some troops there, it's another thing to send more in. I will say the administration has not done a very good job of explaining those cases, either of them, and it's taking place in secret. And I do think that one thing that's beginning to happen is that there are more U.S. troops going into some of these areas, and it can pass by unnoticed for a while, but not forever. And I think they owe it to the troops and to the people to explain why and to lay it out. And I think that needs to happen, I think, in advance of a decision. On the South China Sea, it's a mixed bag. I mean, the question is on, can the country stand up on their own? I mean, Duterte is getting a lot of attention because he's such a crazy person. And, I mean, he really is a crazy person. And he is the leader of the Philippines. He's a very brutal campaign domestically. But, China had a very fractured relationship with the Philippines over the Scarborough Shoal, and Duterte was elected saying that he was going to go on a jet ski over to the Scarborough Shoal to claim it, and then he got in and he flew to China and he tried to make nice to China. So I think that case is particularly odd, but I would say on the Philippines, ultimately he's trying to play a lot of different sides, but nobody can substitute for the U.S. alliance for the Philippines, because China will not give the Philippines a good deal over time on the South China Sea, and I think they fundamentally know that. And my approach, if I was in government, would be to say, knock yourself out talking to Putin and Xi Jinping. If you think they offer a better deal, go for it, but you'll find out that they won't. So I think he'll be back, or they will be back, the Philippines will be back. The others, I think, are more interesting. I mean, Vietnam is very keen to have a close relationship with the U.S. There are U.S. Navy ships back in Vietnam now, which is extraordinary when you think about the history. For them, that's all in the history. They don't really care about that. They're all about the future. And they see the U.S. as crucial in balancing. But the real worry in the region is that the U.S. will be absent economically, but also possibly from the South China Sea. And what they're worried about at the moment is that Trump may trade North Korea for the South China Sea, that he may say, we won't do anything in the South China Sea because we so need your cooperation in North Korea. And if he does that, Southeast Asia, the U.S. role is very much in trouble. That this was a big problem until, it's still a big problem. There's a huge conference there this week in Singapore. The U.S. did its first freedom of navigation operation under the Trump administration a few days ago. And so that sort of eased some fears, but that needs to be sustained over time. It hasn't been. So I think there are lots of questions. And just the final point in it is, it's very difficult to do all of this without any people in place. So the Trump administration has no Asia team. There's no Assistant Secretary for East Asia. There's no equivalent person in the Pentagon. And so that's a problem. And so they have to fix that too. I think there's a lot of, they can do it. I mean, there are lots of people out there, but the problem is it's a litmus test for anyone who criticized President Trump in the past. They're disqualified. And most of the Republican senior Asia experts did. And so there probably needs to be a compromise of sorts there in order to have an effective policy. But the region is noticing that. I mean, it's a real issue. Great question. The question was, is there a role for other Asian countries in this disordered world? Absolutely. I mean, I really think so. I think India, Japan, but all of the countries in Asia, including China, I think have a huge role to play. Leaving China aside, I mean, every country in Asia, I think, has a fundamental interest in a rules-based regional order that is fair and equitable and treats all countries as sovereign nations, and is also delivering peace and prosperity. And that, I think, is core to the mutual interest. Now, the problem in Asia is that there's no sort of there's regional organizations, but it's less structured regionally than Europe. And so they tend to be what they call sort of a hub and spoke model, where they all have a relationship with the US, but not really with each other. And the big challenge is to try to knit a web together of cooperation. So you have, India working with Japan, working with Australia and others on common issues like upholding the rule of law at sea and building, good institutions. And so that's sort of a challenge. And actually the US has a role to play in encouraging that. And ideally it would end up being completely autonomous, with a strong US role, of course, but you would have all this other cooperation as well. So I think there is a real role to play there. Wow, the big question, what's the future of the Trump administration? Days, months, or years, I don't know. Look, I think I didn't, I've been critical of Trump on many things, including foreign policy, and so that's sort of where I'm coming from. But let me just try to be objective about it. I mean, I think he tapped into something, but I think he needs to transition to governing, and he did a couple of smart things early on with the appointments. He appointed some very talented people, Secretary Mattis in particular, but H.R. McMaster and others, to key positions. And he needs to lean on them and to learn from them and show he's capable of transitioning to governing. I mean, this is not the first president with no experience of foreign policy, right? Bill Clinton came in, he had no experience in foreign policy. Jimmy Carter, lots of presidents came in, even George W. Bush. What they all had in common, though, was an ability to learn and evolve over time, where they sort of grew into the role. And I think what's worrying about President Trump is that he hasn't really displayed that yet. And I'm trying to be as fair as I can be, but I think he can do that, right? He has the people around him, but he needs to trust them, and he needs to depoliticize some of it, and to really listen to Mattis, and to really listen to Tillerson, and to work with allies and not take things so personally, because that's really secondary to the core issue at hand. And then to also remember who America's friends and allies are and who America's adversaries are. And I think if he does that, he has the capacity in his team to actually have he could have the guts of a pretty decent foreign policy there. But the big worry that everybody has really is that they know this team is in place, but they worry about what will happen at a time of crisis. And I think he really needs to assuage that. And I think there's a long way to go after last week. But I think that, to me, will be the key part of it, because if he can't master that, at some point something will go wrong, really wrong, and I don't think he'll be able to recover from it. And I hope, I hope he's up to the challenge. So
it's a wonderful question to bring a conclusion.
Thank you so much.
Evening.